of Scholars Great American Literature webinar series. I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, and I have the pleasure of moderating our discussion of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. Now, I am delighted to have three distinguished guests to discuss this. I will say little bits about their CVs, but not all. Dr. Barbara Cantalupo is Professor of English Emeritus at Pennsylvania State University, editor of the Edgar Allan Poe Review, and, well, an extraordinarily long series of publications, many of them on Edgar Allan Poe. Dr. Anthony Magistrale is professor and former chair of the English department at the University of Vermont, taught on, well, all of Anglo-American Gothicism. Works include, the great illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe and Poe's Children, Connections Between Tales of Terror and Detection. Dr. Jason Peters is associate professor of English at Hillsdale College, editor-in-chief of Local Culture, a journal of the Front Porch Republic, and I'm going to say the book, which has, I think, clearly the best title, The Culinary Plagiarist, Misadventures of a Lusty, Thieving, God-Fearing Gourmand, which everyone should read. There is a long series of books by all of them. They should be appearing in the chat button at the bottom, posted by one of my colleagues soonest, with links to Amazon. Everybody, go to Amazon, purchase all their books at once. I am going to say a little bit about the format. Alphabetical order by last name, each of the panelists speaking conversationally, 12 to 14 minutes, then a Q&A, ideally prompted by questions by you, the audience, which I will convey in whatever order seems fun for a conversation. Please put your questions, as many as you can, into the chat or Q&A buttons at the bottom. I will convey them. They can be read by the professors. The professors during the Q&A can simply chat and discuss with one another. If your questions don't get answered, do not worry. Please send email to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will be delighted to forward any unanswered questions or any further questions that occur to you to the panelists so that they can have the option to respond to you. And do not worry if you have to leave halfway through. This is being recorded and will be put up onto the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. You will be able to see all of this whenever and forward it to anyone within 24 hours. That's all the housekeeping. I'm going to go at once. Professor Cantalupo, may I ask if you'll be so kind as to begin?
Okay, I will try to do my slideshow the way I'm supposed to, and if you'll be patient with me, I will hopefully be able to do it. Share screen, where is it? Okay, now I did it before, but now I can't do it. So let's see. Oh, share. There we go. No, share. Okay, this is not working as I feared. So I will talk a little bit and hopefully somebody will help me figure out how to do this. Well, you suggested that I start with an overview of the story. So I'm going to, oh, I see, share screen. Okay, I figured it out, even though I'm a little behind here. Okay.
Wonderful, that's working.
All right, slideshow. Okay, I wanted to start with a little overview of the House of Usher. It begins with the narrator. Actually, that's who I'm going to talk about mostly, not Roderick Usher, the main character, or the protagonist, or whatever way you want to talk about it. Anyway, the narrator shows up after receiving a very unusual letter from a long-lost friend, Roderick Usher, to come to his aid, that he was very sick, and both physically and mentally, and needed a friend, and turns out that's Roderick's only friend. So the narrator does do due diligence and shows up at the House of Usher. Before even entering the place, he has a very strong emotional response to looking at the house. This takes up quite a bit of the story, but then finally gains courage, I guess, and is escorted with his horse to the house, and then ushered into the mansion, and meets Roderick, who is prone on the couch, and happy to see him. They go through many days of quote unquote entertaining. At least the narrator tries to entertain Roderick from his deep depression. His sister, Madeline, who is his twin, is apparently very ill, on the verge of death, and then apparently she dies, or so they think. They put her in a coffin, they put her in a vault right underneath the narrator's bedroom. And there she stays for 7 days while, as I said, the narrator tries to entertain Roderick and keep him from his despair. The ending of the story is quite dramatic, and you can see from this picture I have up here that you see the narrator reading, and Usher in his kind of frantic, wide-eyed look, and you see his sister below. Clearly, the ending, when she finds her way out of the crypt, which is very hard to understand how it's possible, but in any case, confronts Roderick, falls on him, and they both die, and the narrator runs out of the house to stand exactly where he was when he started, at the edge of the tarn that surrounds the house. Okay, I think that's a quick plot overview. Some of the questions that were asked for us to talk about had to do with whether or not Poe was influenced. Well, of course he was, by many authors and many texts, Shakespeare, the Bible, Walter Scott, Hawthorne, Dickens, Byron, Coleridge, etc. But one of the things that I thought would be helpful for people to understand are, he did use the resources available to him during his time to come up with, ideas for his story. And early on, we were talking about Ligeia. And in my reading of Ligeia, I focus on Brewster's Letters on Natural Magic, which is a text that it describes the mechanics of creating apparitions, spiritualistic experiences, etc. He also often used this Reese Encyclopedia. We were asked to say what kind of influence he had. Well, clearly Poe's influence is vast. And I just thought, not that we're going to go through these at all, but you can see from the places, Portugal, Japan, France, China, Ireland, etc., he has had a worldwide influence on authors and continues to do so. Now, we were also asked whether or not Roderick and Madeline shared the sense that the house was sentient, that is, that it had feelings, that it could perceive emotions, etc. Now, it's very clear from the story that quite frankly, it's right there. The narrator says the conditions of sentience had been here, he imagined, and in his distorted fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. So not only did Roderick believe that vegetable matter had sentience, but he also was into the mineral kingdom, that is, non-animate objects, as having this sensibility. Now, the narrator, who is his friend, listens to this, but at the end, he says, such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Here, the narrator is looking askance at Roderick in his way of understanding the world in his very distressed state of mind. So I think I've touched on some of the issues that we wanted to talk about, but obviously we will have many more minutes to talk about other details, etc. But I wanted to get to the focus of what I'd like to say about the House of Usher. And if you can be indulgent, there's about a 20-second piece of music that comes up next, and hopefully you can hear it.
When you're down and in trouble and you need a helping hand, and nothing, oh, nothing's going right.
So my focus is on the fact when I thought about this story and also other of Poe's stories, there are very few that are told. Well, there are a lot of them that are told in first person narration, but there are not that many told by a friend of the main character. And people having read that awful Griswold story, well, it is a story because it's not really at all a memoir, suggests that Poe had no friends. Well, that is absolutely impossibly wrong. And one of his closest friends was Kennedy. And he says in a letter to another friend, I'm indebted to him for life itself. And Kennedy, at Poe's death, said that, reminded himself that it was early as 1833 or 4 that I found Poe in Baltimore in the state of starvation. I gave him clothing, free access to my table, and the use of a horse for exercise whenever he chose. In fact, brought him up from the very verge of despair. Now, clearly, then Roderick Usher was on the verge of ultimate despair. And the only other story that is a tale told by a friend who is lending a helping hand would be the Gold Bug, which follows the House of Usher. In both cases, the narrator sees the friend as suffering from a mental disorder of some sort. And I would argue that the House of Usher is a kind of prelude to Poe's prize-winning story, The Gold Bug, which it has very many similarities in relation to not only the format of the story, but also the instances of events. Both the narrator of the House of Usher and Legrand's friend, that is from the Gold Bug, speak about the letter that they get from the main character. In the House of Usher, he said it was wildly importunate nature. It had an earnest desire to see me. He wanted to be cheered up, but he still considered it a very singular summons. That is, he was really taken by this. And the narrator, again, of the Gold Bug says, there was something in the tone of the letter that gave me great uneasiness. The whole style differed from the person he thought he knew. He, as I said in the beginning, the narrator stops before he goes into the house at the edge of the tarn. When I thought about the tarn, I thought, many of Poe's stories, I think Jerry Kennedy talked about this, are not located in the United States. They're often either in places that you don't know where they are. And in this instance of the House of Usher, it probably is set in England. Again, both Roderick Usher and Legrand, who is the main character in the Gold Bug, come from ancient families. Both, and the tarn is a very familiar body or reference to a body of water in England. So the tarn sort of sets the location in some respects. But what I would argue here is that the narrator, it begins to feel exceedingly oppressed by the atmosphere. He began to believe that it was peculiar to this area, to the vicinity. He really becomes obsessed with this. And throughout the story, he talks about this vapor, this gas, this lustrous luxor, the atmosphere of its own, the gloom, the atmosphere sour, oppressive atmosphere, enshrouding the mansion. He becomes a very taken by the ambiance of the place, even before he gets in there. And he tries to help Roderick Usher do what he was asked to do, which is to cheer up Usher. But eventually he learns the futility of all of this effort. He can't make an impression. In fact, it turns out that Roderick is the one who moves him through the story. That is, he involved me and led the way. The narrator says, I wasn't leading the way. And one of the ideas that I think about is nothing I can, prove any other way, but oftentimes depression and being close to someone who's depressed can actually you can get depressed. So there's a kind of infection, and this is spoken of by the narrator. He said it was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me, creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees. The wild influence of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions had an impact on me. It was an irrespective, I can't read it because pictures are there. It pervaded his frame, and at length, this feeling sat upon him on his heart as an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. And you can see in the corner here this picture by Fuseli, which actually the narrator mentions when he's looking at Roderick's paintings, which frighten him because of their lack of concrete form. He says that Fuseli's are frightening, but not as frightening as Roderick's. And this incubus sitting on, pictured here, sitting on the heart of this fainted woman, is called up again when the narrator mentions this. So I don't know how long I've taken because I can't see my clock, even though I was told I could. But I wanted to end my little speech here by suggesting that not only did Poe influence writers all over the world, he also influenced, which I'm over 700, probably 800 at this point. Burton Pollen did a study of all of the artists who were influenced by Poe. And I would suggest this kind of off-the-wall reading of the story, and something that's caught my mind the whole time that I've read it, is the very last words when the narrator sees the fragments of the House of Usher fall into the tarn. The last words are italicized. So I have this theory that the narrator is actually Poe is posing the narrator as the artist who is creating the story, which, whether or not it actually occurs, is called into question. That is, since there are so many references to art, both music, poetry, fiction, almost dance in the poem that's there, although the seraphs are flying, they're not really dancing. But you have almost all of the arts being mentioned in the fall of the House of Usher. And there is a reason why this last phrase is italicized. And I'm suggesting that it's because it's a story about writing a story. Anyway, I can't prove that here. But as I was saying, he also influenced a lot of artists. And I would like to just go briefly through a number of them. James Ensor, Belgian artist. That's a self-portrait on the left there. Rackman, of course, very strong imagery. Magritte, there's a recent article in Poe Studies on Poe's influence on Magritte. Of course, we all, well, not we all, many of us know that Doré's renditions of the Raven, this is only a few of them. And we have Manet, also enthralled by the Raven. And this last, Gary Hoover, in the edition of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is obviously very lurid. And that's all I have to say. And I don't know if I did 12 minutes, 10 minutes, or what it is. Now I have to stop my share. Okay, and I'm back to normal here.
Thank you so much, Professor Cantalupo. Thank you so much, and Professor Magistrale.
I'm going to pick up on some points that Professor Cantalupo began us thinking about, but I'm going to focus less on the narrator and more on Roderick himself, and particularly his sister, who often goes unnoticed because she doesn't have any speaking role in The Fall of the House of Usher, and she makes an exit, a little premature, but she comes back for a reprise later on. But I also want to talk about the house, because the house seems to me to be like a character in this story, as much of a character as Roderick and the narrator himself, maybe more so, because that house looms over everything. Professor Cantalupo took us on a little journey through Poe's influences. Well, one of those influences was the Gothic, and particularly the idea of the house as a place that has a certain kind of embodiment with it, usually some sort of sin that has been committed in the house. And that begins with the very first Gothic novel, Walpole's Castle of Otranto in 1764. And Otranto begins a whole tradition of haunted houses that go through England and Germany. But we didn't have any castles in America. And so Poe had to rely on a house. And I think it's probably fair to say that The Fall of the House of Usher gives us that first house that will carry on through generations of writers and filmmakers, going all the way from The Fall of the House of Usher to Lovecraft, Stephen King's the Shining, the Overlook Hotel, the Amityville Horror, all of these places that take their cue, if you will, from the house itself. Okay, that said, let's go to talk about what's the problem here, because there's a very serious problem here. Roderick has summoned his friend, his childhood friend, because things have gone awry and we don't quite know what's happened. Why are Roderick and his sister not communicating very well? Why is there some sort of problem within the Usher mansion and within the Usher legacy? So I want to begin with just this quote. It's a short quote. I should have put it up on PowerPoint. I'm sorry I didn't do this, but you'll see another piece of PowerPoint very shortly. Here's the narrator speaking about Roderick Usher. I'll read it slowly. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. Okay, key phrase there that I want to draw your attention to. An agitated mind laboring with some oppressive secret. Now, staying with the Gothic tradition and considering what most critics think about The Fall of the House of Usher, that oppressive secret is typically called incest. That Roderick and his sister have an incestual bond, which of course makes complete sense given it the Gothic tradition and the way in which incest permeates the Gothic, but also the way in which these two siblings are interacting with each other. There's some sort of mysterious secret that they share that has caused a rift between them. And it's clearly infected or is connected to, in some way, the Usher House and the Usher legacy. This oppressive secret, the silent sister, the distracted brother, the disease-afflicted siblings that are, according to Poe, numbed in apathy. Okay, I'm going to do a share screen now myself. This is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, a wonderful exegesis of 19th century American literature, where Toni Morrison talks about the figure of the African American in our fiction and the way in which so many, Toni Morrison, of course, being a Black woman herself, she talks about the way in which Black and white interact in American literature. So if you stay with me, if you look at this, that's why I had this put up here for you, so you could all get a look at this. She starts off talking about Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which was written pretty much about the same time as Poe was working on The Fall of the House of Usher. And she's speaking especially to the ending of The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, where two of the main characters, Pym and Peters, are floating along with a captive that they've taken away from an island that they've been on called Nunu. And they're floating on a warm milk-white sea under the white ashy shower. The Black man dies, the boat rushes on through the white curtain behind which a white giant rises up. After that, there's nothing. No more narrative. Instead, there's a scholarly note, an explanation, an anxious pile-up conclusion. The latter states that it was whiteness that terrified the natives and killed Nunu. And this is a really interesting line. No early American writer is more important to the concept of African Americanism than Poe. No image more telling than the one just described, the visualized, but somehow closed and unnotable white form that rises up from the mist at the end of the journey. Skip down to the bottom of the page. Both are figurations of impenetrable whiteness that surface in American literature whenever an Africanist presence is engaged. And then this, I think, very pregnant paragraph. These images of impenetrable whiteness need contextualizing to explain their extraordinary power, pattern, and consistency, because they appear almost always in conjunction with representations of Black or Africanist people who are dead, impotent, or under complete control. These images of blinding whiteness seem to function as both an antidote for and meditation on the shadow that is companion to this whiteness, a dark and abiding presence that moves the hearts and texts of American literature with fear and longing. I think Morrison's point is that you can't separate the presence of this overwhelming whiteness that she describes, that she sees in Pym and elsewhere in American literature, from the fact that it highlights Blackness. So let's keep that in mind for just a minute. Later on in the story, after Madeline Usher has been buried, apparently prematurely, the Usher house is bathed in a similar luminosity. Again, quoting from The Fall of the House of Usher. The under surfaces of the huge masses of, but under the surfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exaltation, which hung about and shrouded the mansion. So in other words, if I could draw the connection here between what Toni Morrison is pointing out at the ending of the novel Arthur Gordon Pym, and at this moment in The Fall of the House of Usher, where the house seems to embrace a similar kind of whiteness, or the whiteness embraces the house. Either way, however you want to look at it that way. And we need to remind ourselves about that house and the mansion's history, its legacy, that there were servants. We know there were servants in that house because they're mentioned in the story. We know there's a certain level of decadence and decay. The fact that Roderick has a hard time finishing any of his projects things remain incomplete, and he remains incomplete. The difficulty that he has on eating certain foods, wearing certain clothes, everything has to be just right for him, or else for some reason it adds to his agitation. These two siblings are at the end of the Usher legacy. And they're siblings that bear the numbing weight of history. What kind of history? Well, the history of their own family, and maybe even the history of their own culture. Because we don't quite know where this house is located, do we? But it does have a certain sense of the plantation about it, of the American South. The Usher House resembles, if nothing else, a plantation house. A home that was built with the wealth and the guilt of generations that came before it. So what are we talking about here? A tale that was published in 1839 by a Southern gentleman, 30 years old, Poe was at the time that he published this story, a man who had witnessed the institution of slavery firsthand. We've got a lot of whiteness in this tale, not a lot of blackness. Just like there's the invisibility of blackness that Toni Morrison talks about, that exists in Arthur Gordon Pym, the novel, but that also exists perhaps in this story. There are no blacks mentioned in this tale. They are invisible, just as they become invisible, or maybe enveloped is a better word, just as they become enveloped in Pym at the end of the novel. The abolitionists had argued all through the 19th century that the institution of slavery dulled the moral faculties of both the master and the plantation itself, as well as the culture that had tolerated it. So I'm wondering here, in this strange take on a strange story, if the Usher twins might not be read as products of the plantation system, that they are estranged from each other and from their community, but also from the very house that had for generations sustained, for lack of a better phrase, the stain of a peculiar institution, namely slavery. And if I could take you once more into the text, the narrator speaks thus, trying to figure out what's wrong with Roderick Usher. He says, the result was discoverable. He added in that silent yet inopportune and terrible influence, which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him what I now saw what he was. One more time. The terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him, Roderick Usher, what I now saw him, what he was. Not only Roderick, but also Madeline as well. And perhaps that's one reason why Madeline says nothing, but just remains this white shroud, this white figure that kind of floats in and out of the various rooms, just as she floats in and out of the various lives in the Usher mansion. I think that's what I had to say to you guys.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Magistrale. We go now to Professor Peters for the third of our presentations, talks.
Well, hello, everyone. Very happy to be a part of this. I came across a interesting passage this morning from Hawthorne, from the Blithedale Romance. The narrator, Miles Coverdale, says, "The greatest obstacle to being heroic is the doubt whether one may not be going to prove oneself a fool." Seems appropriate for what I'm about to do here, because I want to run a reading of the story. May prove me to be a fool. It's a reading of the story that I have been, on the one hand, becoming more and more convinced of, and then on the other hand, been trying to talk myself out of for a number of years. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that the Fall of the House of Usher is in fact a philosophical allegory. And that is an allegory of the Cartesian divide. And there are a few reasons that I think this may be the case, and I'm going to list those as a matter of first business here. One is that there is a conflation, as we all know, I think, between the house of Usher and the lineage of Usher, which is to say the relationship between the house and the family is very close. The house itself has vacant windows that are like vacant eyes. And the house is divided by a barely discernible fissure. What the narrator tells us is a barely discernible fissure that runs from the very top of the house to the very bottom and then disappears into the waters of the Tarn, which is to say, it's a divide that's even bigger than we can see because of its disappearance into the waters, just as there is clearly a divide between the twins, Roderick and Madeline, who nevertheless apparently have or had at one time the capacity to communicate in ways that most of us don't, which is to say, perhaps even telepathically. Secondly, the reason I want to read it as an allegory is that it's a somewhat schematic story, the way I think maybe Poe's Ligeia, which bears some similarities to this, is also a schematic story. And that has to do with the nature of the two twins, and I'll say more about that in a moment. The third reason I want to read this as an allegory is that I think, unlike some of Poe's stories, there's a movement in it from the particular to the universal. And we have an opportunity to see in the Fall of the House of Usher the universal in the particular and the particular in the universal as well. That is to say, I think the story begins as a localized tale and it ends something more like a story that happens on a larger scale. So I want to suggest that for these reasons, at least, that there is something like a philosophical allegory going on. And as I said, that is an allegory of the Cartesian divide. Now, by the Cartesian divide, I mean that there is the split between mind and matter that didn't begin with Descartes, but he articulated it very early on in the suggestion that we can carve reality up into two categories, mind and matter, or res cogitans and res extensa. And this made possible the methodologies of science, because it suggested to us that there is no real connection between matter and what we think about it. It is the job of mind to find out how matter works, and if it can do that, then we can get on with the project of manipulating it to our own advantage. You might remember that Thomas Paine had said in The Age of Reason that whether we wake or sleep, the vast machinery of the universe goes on, which is another way of saying it doesn't matter what we think about the world, it operates according to its own principles, and there is nothing about mind that has any influence on matter. Or as physicists might say later on, that the perceiver is in Thomas Paine's view, the perceiver is not implicated in what he perceives. Whereas I think in Poe, this is not true. I think he is deeply worried about this divide between mind and matter. Professor Magistrale said that, and he said it well, that there's a there's a problem in this story, and I want to suggest a different sort of problem from the one that he did. And that there is a split between mind and matter, and in Usher the problem is dire, partly because it's indiscernible. And this is the importance of the image of the fissure that runs from top to bottom in the house. The narrator tells us that it's barely discernible. You cannot see this crack. The whole structure looks as if it is perfectly solid, and nothing is going to happen to it, except it's on the brink of crumbling. And it's a really interesting image. If anybody has ever done any work on old houses or any work in construction, you will sometimes come across a structure that is so poorly designed or so poorly made or in such bad shape that you wonder, how could this thing still be standing? And yet it is still standing. There's a integrity there that the evidence has something else to say about. And in the Fall of the House of Usher, the family line and the house are about to come crumbling down, but everything seems fine. And I would like to suggest that maybe this is the situation that Poe is foreseeing, and the situation that we ourselves may in fact find ourselves in a world in which everything looks good. We seem to be figuring things out. We've got pretty good control over the natural world. And yet it may be the case that it's about to all come crumbling down, and we just don't know that because we cannot see that there's a crack from top to bottom, and we don't understand the divide that is represented between these two main characters. I want to draw your attention to a passage that is very important, I think, in respect to Roderick. This is the passage in which we learn about the nature of his malady. He entered at some length into what he considered to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered from a morbid acuteness of the senses. Now, this is the sentence that sets off a careful cataloging of all five senses and Roderick's relationship to them. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food, there's taste, was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture, there's touch. The odors of all flowers were oppressive, there's smell. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, there's sight. And there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. There is the sense of hearing. I think maybe we're given permission to think of Roderick because of this passage as somebody for whom bodily life in this world is utterly intolerable. And what he wishes to do is to be rid of it and to dwell in the realm of pure mind. And this may be the reason that he is interested in painting only ideas or only abstractions. We're told if ever anyone ever painted an idea, it was Roderick Usher. It's a curious line. Art is by nature and definition, I think, incarnational. It begins an idea, but it must take form. It must be made manifest in the physical world. And yet, for Usher, all ideas remain ideas, even on the canvas. Bodily life to him is intolerable. He wishes to live somehow in the realm of pure mind. His sister, by contrast, suffers an opposite malady. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent, although transient, affections of a partially cataleptical character were the unusual diagnosis. In other words, even as Roderick wishes to dwell in the realm of pure mind, his sister suffers from an opposite malady, which is to say her body is wasting away and she has difficulty responding physically to stimuli. This is the nature of her catalepsis. And of course, Madeline is put in the grave prematurely. And I wonder if Poe isn't, in fact, a little bit worried about a divide between mind and matter and a future point at which the desire to dwell in the abstract, dwell in the realm of pure mind, will mean finally the denial of the body altogether. So that it's not just the wasting away of Madeline that we witness, but it is Roderick getting rid of the manifestation, the representation of the body altogether with a premature burial. Imagine that, a premature burial in a Poe story. But to summarize where I've been here so far, I see Poe as setting up a Cartesian scheme in which Roderick represents mind, Madeline represents body. And Roderick maybe is more the person whom we can best identify with right now. He wishes to be rid of all the duties, all the obligations, and all the encumbrances of the flesh to live in the realm of pure mind. This is something I think that we academics suffer from rather too frequently. Then I think in order for this reading to work, we have to see that there's a transition that takes place the night of the storm when the narrator begins to read the mad tryst, the tale, the romance to his friend Roderick. The narrator can't sleep. There's a storm outside. Roderick opens the windows. It's a very beautiful, but also a frightening storm. The narrator insists that the windows be closed. He reads the story about Ethelred and the dragon. There's this archetypal conflict between man and beast. Ethelred is trying to kill the dragon with his mace. Oftentimes, this story is presented to us as the battle between human life and death itself, the slaying of the dragon. And even as the dragon is being slain at this point of the story, we understand that Madeline is somehow making her way out of the tomb, out of the grave. She revives. She's very visceral in this death scene. She's bloody. She's covered with gore. She falls upon her brother Roderick. They fall together to their deaths. The narrator gets out of there, and it's not just the family line. It's not just the Usher people, but the Usher house that comes crashing down. Or to put it in terms of the allegory, the consequences of a complete divide between mind and matter is not just the destruction of the human person, but of the place that the human person has been placed, that is to say, the earth itself. The house and the family are destroyed. And then to sew this up, this will be the last point, we get something like a very universalizing or apocalyptic ending. I didn't mention the haunted palace, which is the poem that Poe added to a later version of the tale. I think it can be used in support of this reading of the story. But anyway, here's how the story ends. From that chamber and from that mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I had before spoken, as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened, and there came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous, shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. And the Cartesian parable is complete in this enlargement of the story at its apocalyptic close, all those allusions to the Bible. That's what I have to say about the philosophical allegory that I think the fall of the House of Usher may in fact be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I thank you all, and I'm going to encourage the audience, please, questions into the chat and Q&A button. I'm going to have a first question on a slightly, different angle, just for fun. I'm going to presume three audiences always: a popular audience, a critical audience, and an audience of fellow artists. My question would be, what appeals about Poe's House of Usher to each of these three audiences? And indeed, one can say at the time, in the 19th century, at the present moment, but I'm going to assume each of these gets something different out of the story. What parts of it attract which of those three audiences the most, to any and all?
I think to a general audience, the point of friends helping each other out of depression and serious malaise is an experience that Poe positions himself as a kind of a psychologist. And I think a lot of what attracts Poe to people, aside from the Gothic and the horror and the suspense and all of the other things, is his acute sense of the human condition and the psychology of relationships, which I think in the House of Usher is seen in many ways, both with Madeline and Roderick, but also with the narrator's efforts, as I said before, to try to help him. And he gets sucked into it, and to the point of complete fear. So fear is something clearly Poe really understood. And fear is something I think every human being at some point in our lives feel. We feel it. We understand how it can grow, how it can exacerbate itself and expand into something which allows us not to move, not to think, not to do anything. So I think the fear issue is an important one.
Thank you, Professor Magistrale.
And I'd like to split. I'd like to create an Usher-like split between your popular audience and your artistic respondents, okay? And I'd like to remind everybody that Poe was really the first writer to seriously take on mental illness.
Yeah.
And that The Fall of the House of Usher, if we read it through the lens of someone suffering from mental illness, Roderick Usher is manic depressive. Roderick Usher may be schizophrenic, but the point is that almost always in Poe, we are looking at some sort of diagnosis of mental illness before we had the psychology to be able to label that.
I think he himself had this sensitivity that he describes in Roderick, probably not as much as he positions Roderick to have, but clearly there was the whole thing about when he was living in New York City, about how they really should do something about paving the streets so that the horses and the wagons don't make so much noise, there's paving stones. He was concerned with paving stones. I mean, there's a kind of way in which that position, as you suggested, is a factor that attracts people, because all of the, like the Telltale Heart, you name it, the Black Cat, all there's so many stories of people taken by mental illness, and even his comic tale about I can't remember the name because I'm getting old and I don't remember names, but the story about the mental institution. Which one is that now? What was it called? The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, where the whole idea of how do we treat mental illness is raised in a very kind of comic but yet serious way. So I agree.
Did Sigmund Freud read Poe, and is psychiatry really a subsection of Poe?
Probably. I think he was more an artist than a psychiatrist, but anyway.
But he did read Poe.
Yeah.
Poe. And so did Marie Bonaparte. Who was
Well, yes, she did, obviously.
She wrote one of the first psychoanalytic biographies of Poe.
Right.
But I also want to remind us, since I have the floor for just a second here, I also want to remind us that how often Poe injected moments of humor into his stories. The Cask of Amontillato's got a lot of humor in it, even though it's a horrible tale about revenge and punishment. And the quote that Professor Peters was talking about from The Fall of the House of Usher, where Roderick had to have certain kinds of foods and certain kinds of clothing. You almost want to hand him a bottle of Downy and say, try this, Roderick, it may help. And all of these things that are associated with, you can only eat certain kinds of foods, probably white rice somewhere in there. But the point is that I think Poe's having a lot of fun in creating this image of this guy who is so damn sensitive that he's allergic to everything.
You're making an argument for the humor, which I very much like. I'm going to go on to another question, and that was about the Gothic Romanticism. I want to pick up on that. This was mentioned, and how much of what he's doing is new within Gothic Romanticism? How much of it's actually American as opposed to the various European cousins? And I suppose one way to put it is, so why didn't Verdi make an opera out of Poe rather than say, Spanish romantics instead, Trovatore? I know it did eventually get to be opera, but there's a lapse. Is there actually some distinction in the American Gothic romantic imagination, which was somehow not quite appealing in the same way? All of that together, to any and all.
I just want to say that's a really good question. I think that's a really important question, but I'll let my colleagues take it from here.
I can't answer that question. I wanted to deal with when you were talking about, Tony, about the Gothic house and all of that as being placed in the United States. I would argue with that only insofar as the quote that you read said the house for centuries. Well, in 1830 something, we were not around for centuries. So I would say that I understand the trajectory of the Morrison reading, but I don't see the house as being in America. That is, I don't see it as an American Gothic. I think he's just playing with this kind of British Gothic. So, and also, where do we have causeways over houses on plantations? It doesn't quite work. Anyway, sorry, I'm being my usual contrary self.
One of the things I would add, I guess, is that I like Poe because he doesn't seem to share the American obsession with originality, at least not to the extent that we see in Emerson, in Thoreau a little bit. Melville, of course, makes a great deal of Hawthorne's originality. I don't see Poe caught up in that problem of a distinctly American literature as opposed to the literature that is kind of got a flunkiest attitude toward European literature. In this respect, I don't see him trying all that hard to say, my Gothic is American. It's not continental.
Look, I'd jump in here and say, look, what Poe brought to the Gothic was a psychological edge that was missing in the Gothic. Poe took the roller coaster ride of writers like Monk Lewis, Horace Walpole, all the Gothic iconography that existed in the generation before Poe started writing, and he took that and psychologized it. Someone once asked Poe, "Are you not essentially duplicating what's going on in the German shocker tale," which was, of course, very popular at the time that Poe was writing? And Poe said, I'm trying to get this right. Poe said, "My horror is not of Germany, but of the soul."
Right.
There's, by the way, a follow-up question from Michael. Is that why Poe was well received by Continentals? By the way, along with all the other comparisons, E.T.A. Hoffman has much been made about Poe as a parallel to Hoffman, and indeed and you're nodding. Has anything more interesting been said than just me saying Poe and Hoffman in the same sentence? In fact, when you were talking about the psychology, actually, I was thinking like the Nutcracker originally might be said to have a certain psychological depth. German again, but perhaps a good parallel. Oh, okay. Well,
we're not going anywhere here.
Okay, yeah, all right. We don't. I'm going to actually. All right, this is. I have a question about prose and poetry. So we all know Poe could do. He was ambidextrous. He could do prose and poetry. Why is this a story rather than a poem? What about it needs to be done in prose rather than poetry?
Well, I think he includes poetry in the story. I mean, later
All right.
he did this, but nonetheless, that is one of the forms in the story. And, as you were saying, I'm sorry, I'm very bad with names, but the Cartesian divide person, tell me.
Professor Peters.
What?
Professor Peters.
Peters. Okay, Professor Peters. Now I lost my thought, of course. Forget about it. I'm not. I had an idea, but I forgot what I was going to say. So we'll go forward.
Could I speak to it in just practical terms?
Sure.
Because it made money. He didn't make money. That's why he wasn't a poet anymore. Well, that's wrong. He was always a poet, but he wanted to be a poet above all else. That was his main consideration. He wanted to be the next Byron, and he couldn't make a living at writing poetry. You could, however, make a living at writing short fiction, which of course Poe brought to really an apex. And you could make money writing The Fall of the House of Usher and then sending it to various magazines to collect royalties from those magazines. This was not just published once, but multiple occasions, and he did that with a lot of his work.
I just remembered what I was going to say to Professor Peters. The poem in there is clearly a way to think about the mind, right? I mean, that's what the poem's about, that the evil forces came and destroyed this beautiful mind that existed. So, that's another way that Poe uses the poetry, but it had to be prose because I think if I can prove someday in writing that this is a story about writing stories, thinking about the philosophy of composition that he wrote, etc., it would have to be a story to be able to fit my reading with the poem inside the story. And then we all know at the end of near the end of his life, he wrote Eureka, which he called a prose poem. And said that he could die now because he'd done everything that he could do in writing. He had made his masterpiece. The poem really does fit into that Cartesian model that you were talking about, Professor Peters. Just wanted to mention, at least I got it back anyway.
And Professor Peters, do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the practical answer is that Poe was making money. I mean, he knew how to tell a story to make money, and he was making money. I think you can theorize about whether a writer has a certain degree of artistic patience for one form or another. You could probably make the case that this thing presented itself to Poe in some unconscious way as a tale instead of as a poem, and it took shape organically as it did. Those are all interesting ways of getting at this. I think he knew how to tell a story that would pay for the next cup of sack.
In that case, I will follow up from that one with a question again to you from Keith Whitaker. For Professor Peters, regarding the cause of the fall, is there a link between incest and philosophic duality? On the face of it, they might seem opposites.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm a little bit worried about on this reading of mine. But you consider, on the one hand, it's an ancient line. It's an ancient house. Whoever is around in the area, people in the community whom the ushers have no connection with, they all make that connection between the line and the house and its antiquity. Roderick suffers from a kind of ennui. He's, you might say, bored with the mental habit that he is in and a part of. I get the feeling, I don't know if I can make this work or not, but I get the feeling that the incest theme is, in a sense, a way of elevating the problem, the philosophical problem, as Poe sees it. In other words, if indeed there is something like a philosophical problem at the heart of this story, how do you express how bad that thing is? Incest is not a bad way to do it. It's not a bad way to talk about, additionally, it's not a bad way to talk about how an intellectual habit or a problem can perpetuate itself without collateral issue, as the narrator tells us, without influence from the outside. So, last thing here, it may well be the case that all of us who live after the scientific revolution we are caught in ways of thinking and habits of thought that could use somebody from the outside. And turns out in this story, even the narrator is not a sufficient outside source to save the problem that's coming. And I think Poe thinks it is coming. I happen to think so too.
And do either of other panelists want to pick up on this question?
I just had a funny thought, which is sort of irrelevant on some level, but this kind of isolation in this house, it sort of reminds us of COVID, doesn't it? This kind of serious isolation that impacts one's ability to understand that there's a world out there. So I think, I know it's silly. It has nothing to do with anything, but it just brought it to mind when you were saying it, isolation. And we become absorbed in our own thoughts. So
it would get us to the mask with the Red Death in any
oh
case.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Professor Magistrale.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the narrator comes and is often read as a rational skeptic, and that he enters this madhouse, the Usher mansion. And what happens to the narrator in the course of the story is, instead of helping Roderick and stabilizing things, he becomes part of the Usher world. You know, it's almost as if the house transforms him as well, so that at the end he's fleeing, you know, this place that he's come to voluntarily with a hope to try to help. And what we're left with at the end is the rational skeptic, or at least the rational fellow, has turned into another one of the Usher madmen.
I don't know if I would agree that he was quite rational when he went in. He seemed to be quite out of it, very oppressed by what he saw, his effort to, that's part of the reason that I think it has to do with the composition of story writing, in that he tries to transform what he sees with his eyes and as a way in the looking in the tarn, and it's transposed, which is sort of like what happens in photography. He's trying his best to make something change in his mood, and it turns out this new combination is even more horrific than what he saw with his eyes. So I don't know that he's quite rational when he walks through that gate.
But you're not looking at it in context. In comparison to Roderick, this is a guy who comes from the outside world. This is a guy who enters into the Usher house, and compared to what's there, a sister who can't talk anymore because she's so traumatized, and a guy who can't wear clothes. You know, you've got this fellow from the outside who comes in there, and then he certainly doesn't represent the internal world of the Usher house. But it changes him.
Well, that's what I was saying about depression, or trying to help somebody with depression, that you become absorbed in it as much as and become destroyed by in the same way. I mean, luckily he could flee the house so he could tell the tale. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a story. And he's standing at the tarn. He's looking in the tarn again. I mean, the ending and the beginning are so close that you can't ignore it. There's a reason for that. Poe did it for a reason. Anyway.
And I suppose any of us can aspire to is to be relatively balanced compared to our neighbors. I could have a question from Daniel. Did Poe have a special relationship with his editors? And I'm going to ask, they're his first audience, of course. Is there any sense in which, well, this story in particular, his stories in general, were written with an eye not just to a popular audience, but to particular editors and their tastes and preferences?
Mm-hmm.
I can say with absolute certainty that I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I think the way I would answer it is he became his own editor when he became editor of the Broadway Journal, and where he published stories that had been published before, and clearly Kennedy got him a job. So I'm sure that he cared about being accepted, but I don't think he wrote with an editor is in mind. In other words, I don't know that for a fact, but I don't think, from my understanding of how his work is published, that he would do something like that. I think he was concerned with writing a piece of art that held the kind of integrity that he felt was absolutely important, which is having a unity, having an effect on his audience. I think his main concern was having an effect. I don't think until he became his own editor. Obviously, he was free to republish a whole bunch of stuff in the Broadway Journal.
He had a lot of trouble with his editors. I think he had a lot of trouble with men in general.
Yeah.
He had a difficult time interacting. So, I mean, there's a kind of classic pattern to Poe's behavior with men, but this would include editors as well, that things would go along swimmingly for about a year or so. And then Poe would start to get drunk and get a little belligerent, and money would become an issue, and there would be a falling out, and usually a falling out that proved to be pretty nasty. It's almost like the narrator coming into the Usher house. At first everything's okay. I'm going to help smooth things over here. Help you guys work through this problem you're having in your family. And eventually it just everything went to hell. And that was true with his editors too, David, that he had very heavily contentious relationships with his editors. And usually it was because of money and booze.
Yeah, that was true with the Broadway Journal when he was hired. He blew it. I mean, he was admired, and then he blew it altogether, but then he got to own it. So he was quite happy. It turned out that was a good thing to have an argument over. So didn't last long though.
Yeah. I'm going to have a slightly different question again. Teaching. College students who come in at this point, how much have they already read Poe? How do you have to teach Poe and introduce Poe to undergraduates? And how has this changed over the course of your teaching careers? Particularly, if you can talk about this story in particular, but other stories too.
Well, I've been at it for about 35 years, maybe a little more. And Poe is the one writer whom college students, in my experience, have read. Poe is still being assigned. More so, I think, than the other 19th century stars of Hawthorne and Melville, and, Thoreau. But that's I don't know if it's partly because he's still in the popular culture. I mean, he pops up in episodes of The Simpsons, and he pops up here and there, and he's irrepressible. You can't keep him down. But that's due to his greatness, and it's due in part to his appeal. They tend to have they tend to have the Vincent Price approach to Poe when they get to school, which is he's pretty good for Halloween, but otherwise, what do you do with him? I think we were talking before this opened up. I think that Ligeia, which Poe thought was his best story, is a really interesting philosophical investigation to the romantic response to 18th century rationalism. I mean, there's a lot going on in Poe, and this is what I think the students really respond to, what they like to get out of Poe. If you can take them into that deeper chamber of the house.
I teach a survey course in 19th century American literature. Maybe I start with Crevecoeur, and we go through the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Margaret Fuller. When we get to Poe, everybody perks up. It's like the Transcendentalists, and I'm sorry, this may sound like a slight on Emerson, but the Transcendentalists put contemporary college students to sleep. And, you can kind of liven them up by saying things like, well, did you ever go to the top of a mountain and look out and, feel like you were a transparent eyeball? But when they get to Poe, you don't have to play games. You can let Poe do the work. Poe does the heavy lifting, and the students respond remarkably. It's like suddenly someone's let in a breath of fetid air, and everybody is aware of this. It's suddenly Halloween, regardless of what day it is, and everybody's alive again, ironically.
And
Well,
Professor Cantalupo?
I stopped teaching about a year and a half ago. But one of the things I noticed, which is very curious, is students have read Poe. But most of them have read the sort of sanitized editions. So like when you teach the Dupin stories, for example, not Murders in the Rue Morgue, but the Purloined Letter, for example, both of them start with this philosophical inquiry on how one understands, how one does detection, etc., how one understands how other people's minds work. They don't know what to do with it. It's not this plot. It's not the story. If you teach The Imp of the Perverse, which I always did because I think that's an exceedingly important story for Poe, they're amazed that it's not just plot. So I think there's some enthusiasm clearly for Poe, but the intricacies of his intellectual, philosophical conundrums that he presents, that's new to them. They haven't seen that. So I don't know what students in the last year and a half are like, though, because of COVID. So I grant you tremendous respect for dealing with them. I'm glad I don't have to do it.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually have a question from the audience, which is slightly non-Poe related, but I figure I should be dutiful to the audience. Christine Leibhardt asking, Professor Magistrale, do you find transcendentalism to be very difficult to explain to students? I taught high school for 15 years prior to teaching college. That idea of the transparent eyeball was strangely more relatable to my high schoolers than to my college students.
Yeah, I think you have to do a lot of translating of the Transcendentalists for students in order to make it palpable. I don't think, like Melville, I wrote back to Christine and said, Melville, they find the Transcendentalists lost in cloudland often. But one way I think you can get the Transcendentalists to communicate with contemporary students is to talk about things like climate change. And the way in which the Transcendentalists were so connected to the rhythms of nature and the rhythms of the earth, particularly Thoreau, of course. in Walden. That's one way you can make I think the transcendentalists relevant, because I think it's hard. I think, and they're hard. I mean, Emerson's turgid. You have to work hard to understand Emerson, and I'm not sure I understand him now, and I've been teaching him for 40 years.
I like Poe's take on Emerson. Forget about it. That's it.
Right.
Well, actually, let me just follow up on this. You presumably have, many or all of you have taught Poe with the Transcendentalists. How does teaching Poe help you teach the Transcendentalists and vice versa? What do they bring? How do they enrich the understanding of 19th century American literature period by being able to teach them together?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, I guess. Maybe with an analogy to the realists. I think the students respond to American Romantic writers because there's never not something there to respond to. You can't read a story by Poe, you can't read a story by Hawthorne and be indifferent to it. There's something at work there. And I think maybe with the realists, you begin to wonder whether if there are enough layers there to make it worth the effort. But with the Transcendentalists, I think the student spider sense kicks in sometimes, and there's this idea there's something fishy going on that I'm trying to be had here. Like Emerson's remark that the roses under his window sill bear no resemblance to previous roses. It's just biologically stupid thing to say. And it's not the stupidest thing he said. He said all kinds of stupid things. And he said, he could write terrific sentences too. He could write these wonderful sentences. Man has built the coach, and civilized man has built the coach and lost the use of his feet. I say that to every football player. I say getting on an elevator to go from floor 1 to floor 2. But with Poe, with the other Romantic writers, with Melville, I think is our genius. There's nothing to, you don't have to sell anything. These guys sell themselves, frankly.
Yeah, that's it.
Whereas the Transcendentalists take a little more work. Although Tony's right, there are kind of environmental connections you can make with the likes of Thoreau and Emerson, and that helps.
Could I remind us of one thing that's really important here? That there were those moments. I understand that Poe, used to like to refer to the Concord group as the Frog Pondians, and he used that phrase derisively. But let's remember that there are those moments in Poe where there is a kind of transcendentalism that's at work. I mean, anyone who's read Eureka, anyone who's read Descent into the Maelstrom, you have to come to terms with a kind of transcendental energy that's at work in Poe. It may not be the same as what you find with the Concord group, but there is. Poe was fascinated with crossing over worlds.
I think the key is when Eric Carlson, who's now long gone from us, used to suggest and emphasize the transcendental nature of Poe's work as being a true transcendentalist, as far as the difference being that Emerson and Thoreau weren't really transcendentalists, the so-called transcendentalists. That's what he said. They're so-called transcendentalists. And also I find, my reading of Emerson, I find him to be so egotistical and self-centered, especially well, anyway, I can't imagine Poe taking on that kind of persona. It's far too arrogant as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Poe was a little bit, he was boisterous, but I don't think he was arrogant in the sense of Emerson's arrogance. But that's just my humble opinion.
I'm going to interrupt with 4 lines of poetry and then ask for some closing remarks. James Russell Lowell on Poe. There comes Poe with his raven like Barnaby Rudge, 3/5 of him genius and 2/5 sheer fudge, who talks like a book of iambs and pentameters in a way to make people of common sense damn meters. Anyway, just thought I'd add that to our general enjoyment. May I add, it's so much fun. I would be delighted and honored if I could get sort of a last minute or so closing remark from each of you, on Poe, on what we should take away from him, and then I'll just sort of close up the business for everything on this webinar. I guess in reverse order for this time, Professor Peters, may I ask you to go first?
I wish someone would crack the mystery of Poe's death. I like the strangest theories about it myself, but I'll say for myself that I don't ever get tired of reading Poe. In the same way, I don't ever get tired of reading Moby Dick. I don't ever tire of the Blithedale Romance. I don't even tire of Thoreau's essay Walking, which is basically Thoreau telling us how bad we are all the time. But the thing about Poe for me is that there was such a deep intellect at work there, that he's irreducible. I don't think, I mean, this is something that's borne out in the scholarship. It is really, really difficult to come to a consensus on Poe, and that's not because he's a bad artist, it's because he's a great artist.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Professor Magistrale, may I ask you to go next?
Daniel Hoffman wrote a book several years ago called Poe, 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 Poe. And the reason he called all those Poes is because there are so many Poes. There's Poe, the detective story writer, the inventor of the detective tale. There's Poe, the horror story writer, the Poe that I like the most, I think. There's Poe, the novelist. There's Poe, the hoaxster. There's Poe, the comic genius, the writer of grotesque tales. There are all these different Poes. There's Poe, the essayist. There's Poe, the reviewer, the first of the great new critics. There are all these different Poes, and every one of them turns out to have an incredibly important place in American letters. The contemporary detective fiction, the best novelist is called an Edgar. The best novel that comes out every year is called an Edgar. You know, but Latin Americans love Poe because primarily of his detective fiction. That really appeals to them. God knows where we would be. Where would somebody like Peter Straub or Stephen King be without Edgar Allan Poe? And Poe keeps finding his way into King's work all through the last 45 years of his writing. And there are all these different Poes that are out there. And every one of them has had an impact. That's what's so remarkable. The philosophy of composition still is one of the, even if it is fallacious, there's so much energy in the philosophy of composition that's worth paying attention to. One of the great essays in American literature, without a doubt. And I suppose you could say the same thing about the poetic principle too. But all of these different Poes, and there's even that Poe, the comic writer, that nobody knows about unless you're one of us, and you have to acquaint yourself with this version of Poe. But that's there too, and that's wonderful. And may I recommend to your audience King Pest, one of the great stories of all time, especially in the age of COVID, to read King Pest. For the last 3 years, every time I've started a course on Poe or a class on Poe, we've begun with King Pest. And it's only right, because that and the Mask of the Red Death are all about what we're living right now. He's one of us. In the end, he's one of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well,
Sorry.
just as it was hard to go first, now it's hard to go last after that. I think my attraction to Poe is his insistence on being non-didactic. I think the pleasure that Poe's work has for me has to do with the concept of art for art's sake, that there's a kind of dedication to beauty throughout his life that I've written about, in regard to his attention to the visual arts, his ability to write such beautiful sentences, his poetic sensibility that comes through even in these horror stories and all that attract other people to his work. I think Poe is a true artist, and to admire that genius in relation to his ability to create such well-formed stories, and to see his handwriting is incredible. It's so neat. It's so careful. It's so antithetical to what we think of as of a mad genius, that his notion that art does not come from inspiration, but rather from combination of what we find, a kind of collage of ideas and images. I don't know, all of that is what I love about Poe.
Thank you so much. Look, thank you all so much. And thank you to the audience. We do it for you. You make it possible. Thank you so much for listening. Wonderful to have you. And again, wonderful to have our panelists. I'm trying to thank everybody. I want to just end with the housekeeping bits. Again, unanswered questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. Be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option to respond to you. This will be available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. I will do a plug. If you liked this, please consider joining the National Association of Scholars on our fine webpage. We support this and many other things of great interest, worth, and fun. So please consider that. And I will just mention, we have a number of webinar series. We are continuing the Great American Literature series with, I think I'm missing one of these because I'm not actually moderating one of them, but we are, for example, doing the Maltese Falcon. That's, I believe, November 29th. And we are doing, oh heavens. Well, there are more, and I'm missing it on my particular calendar, but the Great American Literature series is not over. We also have history, inventions. The next one is going to be The Age of Flight. That's going to be Thursday. Tune in 2 days from now for that. And again, if you go to our YouTube channel, you can see all of these different webinar series that is coming forth in the future. Yeah, I think that's about where we are. It's been an honor. It's been lovely. Thank you all so very much.